So I'm very excited today to talk to our guest, Tithi Bhattacharya. Before I introduce you to her, I want to share a few of my favorite quotes from Feminism for the 99%, a feminist manifesto that articulates the need for a massive global feminist movement that fights all forms of oppression. Tithi co-authored this with Chinzia Azua and Nancy Fraser, and I underlined almost every word in the book and was heartbroken when I finished, as their voices were literally alivening my being and nourishing my soul. So my first is at the beginning. Our answer to lean in feminism is kick back feminism. We have no interest in breaking the glass ceiling while leaving the vast majority to clean up the shards. Far from celebrating women, CEOs who occupy corner offices, we want to get rid of CEOs and corner offices. And then the one I really feel that relates to today is, in reality, women are the first victims of colonial occupation and war throughout the world. They face systemic harassment, political rape, and enslavement while enduring the murder and maiming of their loved ones and the destruction of the infrastructures that enable them to provide for themselves and their families in the first place. We stand in solidarity with these women, not with warmongers in skirts who demand gender and sexual liberation for their kin alone. To the state bureaucrats and the financial managers, both male and female, who purport to justify their warmongering by claiming to liberate Black and brown women, we say not in our name. So beyond her book, there are many words to describe the amazing Tithi Bhattacharya. Just a few are feminist, activist, academic, educator, writer, and intellectual. Currently, she's an associate professor of South Asian history at Purdue University in Indiana. She describes herself as a historian by training, activist by choice. Tithi is a prominent voice in the struggle for Palestinian freedom and a national organizer of the women's strike. She's a frequent contributor to Jacobin magazine and sits on the editorial board of Spectre magazine, a new Marxist journal, and is a member of the Feminist Foreign Policy Project. We're so glad you're here, Tithi, and we're looking forward to you sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you. So before we dig into the conversation, could you describe for us, what is your feminism? What does it focus on? How does it inform your vision for a feminist foreign policy?
So first of all, thank you, Jodie, for sharing this space with me. You know, your work, your travels in war-torn zones of the Middle East, your work in peace projects have been so inspiring for me. So I'm really honored to share this space with you. I also want to thank Katie for doing such a phenomenal job of setting this up, doing all the labor behind the scenes of making these webinars possible. Thank you, Katie, for doing all this work. And I want to acknowledge and hold space for all of you who are listening in during these challenging times. Thank you for listening. And I so look forward one day to be able to do this in person so I can see everyone's face and shake hands, you know, and hugs. So missing that contact, but I'm so grateful to be here with you. So Jodie asks a very important question about what is my vision. So, you know, if I could have a soundbite to describe my feminist foreign policy, then I would say that there are no feminist bombs. Similarly, there are no feminist drones or feminist borders. So to follow on from what Jodie sort of read out from our book, just to update that, we now have women CEOs of 4 out of the country's 5 biggest military contractors. Raytheon, which is one of the leading US arms contractor, boasts of its relationship with Girl Scouts. And I'm going to just quote from Raytheon's webpage. It says, Raytheon Technologies and Girl Scouts of the USA are collaborating on a new initiative to fuel the pipeline of female leaders in science, technology, engineering, and math, unquote. I mean, this is surreal for me to see how a weapons manufacturer uses feminist language and language of women's empowerment to rebrand itself. And these poor little girls on the website, you know, reminds me of, I don't know if folks have seen the film, the Korean film Snowpiercer. Parasite made the headlines, but his first film was Snowpiercer, where the entire train is run by the bodies of poor children, while rich children watch on and, you know, and have this brilliant time on the train playing and learning about things and so on. So it was sort of like a surreal echo of Snowpiercer to see happy, smiling faces of children, you know, promoting military contractor companies. So this obviously is not my idea of feminist foreign policy. You know, right now we have Gina Haspel, who once oversaw torture, and she now runs the CIA. So this, to me, is simply imperialism with women at the helm. So that is not in any sense a feminist idea of what foreign policy, etc., could look like. So I'll stop there just to give a sense of what it is not, you know, and then maybe we can talk about a little bit. But I just want to make a distinction that simply because we have women in the leadership of killing machines or killer companies does not make it a feminist project. A feminist project is a set of politics that is about the emancipation of women and all oppressed people. And it is a project for human emancipation in the long run, right? So that's what I would call feminist. But just simply having women in powerful positions does not overturn the dynamics of power. In fact, it makes it harder to fight power when you say, well, why are you fighting this project? Because women are leading it. So suddenly the CIA is feminist because Gina Haspel is in charge. So that is not my idea of feminist foreign policy, and perhaps we can go into what it might be.
So yeah, that's amazing. I just want to stop a minute and on this co-option, you know, because basically what you're describing is the co-option of, you know, what then turns feminism into something you can't really, I mean, it totally destroys a word that, and the meaning that I've grown up with and grown into. And, you know, how do we deal with that co-option? Because, you know, you're nailing something it makes life very difficult for a lot of people. And here we are trying to, you know, a lot of our work in peace is like how much gets co-opted, and you've got to kind of spread it apart to get to what's true.
So I think for me, we have to start by querying the very category of foreign policy in order to imagine a feminist restructuring of global relations, right? So, I mean, that's the real project here. How do we restructure global relations in a feminist horizon and through a feminist vision? And I think the first step for us is to actually explore and perhaps reject the established category of what foreign policy is. Because as we all know, foreign policy refers to relationship between state actors, right? So I think one of the things that Jodie, your work has shown, and a lot of feminist peace activists' work have shown, is that states pursue foreign policy not in the interest of safety of global citizens or even the safety of its own citizens, but for the safety of profits. So all the contradictions that arise in state policy, you know, a state which claims to be a feminist, to have a feminist foreign policy, all the contradictions we see in those policy decisions arise primarily due to the fact that the project of all states is to make the world safe for profits, not people. So three states currently have explicit feminist foreign policy, right? And two are and Mexico is considering it. So Sweden declared a feminist foreign policy in 2014, Canada in 2017, and France in 2019. So this is great. I mean, I think it's wonderful that these governments have chosen to focus on women's rights. Okay, so I think, and these are democratically elected governments. So I think it's a step forward, certainly, that these governments, instead of, they don't have, their foreign policy is not called drone bomb Bangladesh. Their foreign policy, they've chosen to call it feminist. But we also have to be wary when state actors mobilize, or if you like to use your word, to co-opt the word feminist, to attach it to what are actually state policy decisions, right? So we have to be wary of that while we celebrate some of that initiative. So let's look at some of the contradictions. So Sweden, when we think about imperialist nations, we don't think Sweden usually. We think US, UK, so on, France. But Sweden, the military contractor Bofors, this is a company dear to my heart, because one of the very corrupt Indian politicians in my childhood was actually lost his prime ministership due to the Bofors scandal. So this is a major Swedish military contractor, which competes on the same level, global scale, with US and Israel in the development of large, the variety of weapons that are sold to over 55 countries around the world. So this is a Swedish company. So you can't really have a multinational that your state backs on your soil, which is selling weapons to 55 countries around the world, backing imperialist states like Israel and the US, and still have a feminist foreign policy. It's just too much of a contradiction for that to happen. So that's almost like you are taking with one hand and trying to give a very little with one and taking a lot with the other. Similarly, the Swedish multinational H&M, as you know, can sell affordable products in the malls of the global north because of unbelievable sweatshop conditions, labor conditions, mostly by women, actually, in the sweatshops of Bangladesh that H&M run through subcontractors, right? So, and Canada, we can go through, all of the examples of Canadian imperial projects in Latin America, of its treatment of First Nations folks on its own soil, its backing of fracking projects. And we know how the climate threat is a threat multiplier for women. And women are the worst affected by the climate crisis. So again, so all of these states doing their feminist foreign policy, I think is great, but we have to be very, very aware of the contradictions that this engenders, right? So I think we have to get away first and foremost from imagining that a feminism can be crafted at all by a capitalist state. So who do we look towards, right? So for me, I look towards non-state actors and movements. Yeah. So I will give you just one example from the global south, right? So one of the, I'm very privileged to be editing and to be part of a project of a book by feminist, Argentinian feminist activists who were part of the Ni Una Menos collective, right? So the All right, so this is a book about debt, okay, and it is Lucy Carvalho and Veronica Gago, and their book is about how economic terrorism and gender violence go hand in hand with each other. Okay, so one of the things they argue in this book is that in the 1990s, the Washington consensus, well, in the 1980s, the IMF pushed through the debt regimes in Latin America. And in the 1990s, the Washington consensus of neoliberal reforms, further exacerbated the indebted condition of Latin American countries that some people have called financial colonization of Latin America, right? So the Ni Una Menos collective started as a collective against gender violence, yes? So not one more dead woman or girl child. But they also launched the slogan that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. They also launched their slogan, which was, "We want ourselves alive, free, and debt-free." Okay? And this was their slogan a few months after the first international feminist strike. So this was a way of bringing together feminist, in a feminist framework, gender violence and economic violence together, and showing the relationship between these two, right? So in the 2020 international feminist strike in Argentina on March 8th, the slogan that the interpretive slogan that they used in the 2020 strike was, "The debt is owed to us." Okay, so this kind of inverts who the creditors are and who the debtors are. So that, to me, is a concrete example of what a feminist foreign policy can look like, or what the horizons are for us to kind of aspire to and think about as a feminist foreign policy.
Well, that's brilliant. And I think also, I have to think about the sanctions right now and the economic violence of the sanctions around the world in the same way. So yes, thank you for raising that up. I mean, while we're talking about the Global South, what are some other ways that a feminist foreign policy could help women in the Global South materially? How would it change their lives?
So, Jodie, I think this is really something that you've worked practically on the ground on so much, so I really learned from your work a lot on this. But I think let's back up a little as to see what the record of the United States is, right? So this is not a particularly happy story for not just women around in the Global South, but also just ordinary citizens, even of the United States, right? The amount of money that is dedicated to killing, to incarceration, both within and without borders, is actually not happy news, even for citizens of the United States, let alone migrants and people in the Global South who bear the worst brunt of these policies. So if we back up a little, we all know that the United States has, for instance, consistently refused to ratify the UN Women's Rights Treaty of 1979. One of my favorite reasons for that is often given by US politicians. Two of my top favorite reasons why the US will not ratify it is that too much international oversight will undermine federal and state laws, right? So in other words, there is international cooperation, learning from other people and other regions will actually undermine US laws. I mean, think about how ethnocentric and imperialist that is. And the other, which is I think top favorite actually, which is that ratifying the treaty, which has, and the US is in a minority in doing that. Even if we talk about like hardcore foreign policy, like, in state actors, the US is a minority in not having ratified that treaty. And my top reasons for this is that politicians state is it's going to break up the American family, the traditional American family. Okay, so, and to that, my answer is how soon can we do that, right? So, because the traditional American family, as these right-wing politicians understand it, has never been a happy land for women, and forget, gender non-conforming people. So the U.S. has fought, if we look at, I can give you, you probably can give a better list than me about the list of countries where the US has fought wars since World War II, right? And the most recent ones that we know, all the covert operations and the drone bombings, the interference in the Middle East, which has completely destabilized Iraq and on to Syria and so on. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to also draw attention to in terms of US foreign policy, and that's not just overt wars and drone bombings. The US has 1,000 military bases around the world, and these military bases are not welcome by the people who live around the bases. So that's one, which is sort of almost open colonization. The second is that the US military is one of the biggest polluters on the planet, right? So again, this is something that I think is really a feature of a global crisis that we're facing now. So I think when it comes to imagining a feminist foreign policy, I think we have to start at the bottom with non-state actors, and we have to sort of revise or maybe reinvoke the old slogan, nothing about us without us, right? So we cannot have you saving us women of color from above, nor can we have you give aid to particular, corporate interests in foreign countries, which may or may not be helpful to the actual, alleviation of the claim of the problems that they claim to help with. So, the biggest thing is Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, as you all know. It was, absolutely was trumpeted as a solution to women's economic impoverishment, and actually ended up as a debt machine to further indebt women. So my framing, I guess, is from an 2003 interview, something that Arundhati Roy said in a 2003 interview that I really feel strongly about. She says she identified the checkbook and the cruise missile as the tools of imperialism. Okay, so the checkbook, she says, if the checkbook doesn't work, i.e. economic control doesn't work, then the cruise missile comes to play. And, from 2008, I guess we can say cruise missile and drones. So I think for me, any social movement that threatens this compact relationship between the checkbook and the missile opens the door for a feminist discussion of foreign policy. Even if the movement does not call itself explicitly feminist, right? So most often movements of this nature that threatens this control of territorial states have been increasingly led by women. Okay, so whether it is an environmental movement, whether it is the movement against debt, it is mostly it has been increasingly led by women because it's getting harder and harder for women to reproduce their lives and the lives of their families. So any social movement that threatens this relationship between the checkbook and the missile, whether it explicitly calls itself feminist or not, I think is our ally and opens up a horizon for feminist thinking on foreign policy.
Oh, brilliant tools. Thank you to think with. But that, I want to bring us back to really the core, the heartbeat. And you've spoken so eloquently about two things that I think it's like, how does someone feel the heartbeat of a feminist foreign policy movement? And those two things, here with COVID, everyone's learned what's essential, and which brings us back to the care of life and humanity. And you talk about care in a way that I think is so profound. And I think really, if it was a foreign policy that was from the care of life, instead of a foreign policy really is about, violence, oppression, and extraction. And then the other thing is solidarity. Those two that you spoke so eloquently about over the years, I feel like would serve the audience of like, how do you answer, you've answered so many questions and you have such a wealth of knowledge, but what would just be a core thing that anyone out of their heartbeat could talk about? No, that's not it because there isn't care, and no, that's not it because there's no solidarity.
I think you articulated it perfectly, Jodie. So the phrase I use to talk about it is life making as opposed to thing making or profit making, right? So, capitalism is fueled by thing making, the production of dead things, right? Commodities. But it cannot exist without a simultaneous process of life making, because the people who make those dead things have also to be produced themselves. So their lives have to be produced. Now, capitalism is on this, absolutely destructive train ride right now, where it is threatening this mad drive for accumulation for the sake of accumulation is actually threatening all life on this planet, right? So in other words, capitalism is so reckless that it is actually threatening its own conditions of possibility. Because if all life is extinguished, then there will be no capitalism. But it doesn't care. It would rather live for the short-term oil profit than understand what fracking does to the planet in the long run, right? So for me to determine what the priorities of any social struggle or any government should be is to demand, to challenge our governments to allocate resources for life making rather than for profit making, right? So this is something that we have learned so tragically in a clear manner under COVID. We now know, we have always known as feminists, what is the essential work that keeps our society going. But under COVID, everybody knows who the essential workers are, right? And if you look at the list of essential workers across the board, and I have not a single stockbroker on the list, okay? So we know through this tragic pandemic who the essential workers are in our society, and more importantly, what essential work is, what is needed, whose work is needed to keep society running and life-making possible. And think about it, none of the life-making jobs are actually planet-killing jobs. They're all green jobs. More hospitals, more teachers, right, are not going to kill the planet. In fact, it is going to sustain the planet, and it's going to create shelters and neighborhoods of sustainability and education, and just a celebration of our creativity, okay? So prioritizing life-making over profit-making is one. How do we do that? We have to do that with the, then for me, the slogan that the feminist strikes developed since 2017 is very useful, which is solidarity is our weapon, right? So every movement that calls for that, that priority is we need to give our full solidarity to it. So when there are young multiracial crowds on the street calling for the abolition of the police, we need to support that, because that they are calling for resources to be devoted to their community rather than to institutions that police and murder those communities. So these are, to me, all connected threads and veins of this tapestry of life making that should be in the way that we imagine a feminist, not just a feminist foreign policy, but as I said at the beginning, the feminist restructuring of global relations.
Oh, thank you, Tithi. So beautiful. So we're getting to the end of our time, and I wonder if there's anything else you want to share. You know, how, what are other tools that you could share with us about, you know, how we do extract ourselves, our very beings, from the war economy and help be the co-creators of exactly what you've said, you know, a whole world of feminist being?
Well, I mean, I don't have very many lessons for you, Jodie, but for those of you who are listening in, I mean, the first thing I think is through this pandemic, one of the things that we have learned, I think, is to, you know, for me, just the flourishing of community love and people coming together to help each other has been so inspiring to see through the, you know, through the pandemic. You know, to me, capitalist states have responded in a particular way, as we see with Trump and Modi in India. But then we see Palestinian farmers, ordinary Palestinian farmers, leaving food, free vegetables and food on the roadside for people to take. Excuse me. We see Italian working class neighborhoods bursting into song, you know, to cheer their neighbors up. So they're singing to each other across balconies. So we've seen this sort of flourishing, but which to me, you know, shows the sort of resilience of human spirit and sort of the seeds of love and solidarity in the human condition. But it also leaves me angry, because this job of caring for each other and the caring for our communities should not have been left to us. This should have been the job of the governments, okay? And this is where I think the feminist foreign policy piece comes so importantly and is highlighted, that our governments, with the tax money that we've been paying, which obviously some of our state heads have not been paying at all, but you know, for those of us, you know, have been paid, our tax money is going to contractors like Rayathon to make profits rather than to life-making institutions and practices, right? So this is where the domestic and the foreign is so deeply and intimately linked, right? And it's deeply and intimately linked in other ways as well. The police who are shooting down my black and brown brothers and sisters on the streets of Detroit and Ferguson are the police who were trained by the IDF. So the Israeli armed forces train the US police. So our struggles are so intimately connected, both domestically and internationally, that we cannot move further in this climate emergency threatened world without having that solidarity with each other and to celebrate bravery where we see it, right? So that's the spirit of solidarity. When two people go forward and challenge these powerful state actors, we need to stand with them and tell them that they're not alone.
Oh, Tithi, I could listen to you forever. I'm so grateful for you sharing your wisdom and your heart. I love that it's yes at home to be sharing and elevating and nourishing our hearts as we are human beings together. and that and knowing the, you know, uplifting the best of ourselves and not believing the lie about, you know, the capitalism wants to tell us about ourselves. And then yes, we have to force policy change. If we're going to pay taxes, the state needs to behave for the people. And there's models of that that are quite beautiful that we can look to right now. So Tithi, thank you so much for joining us. I hope to have you back again. Thanks for all you do and all you share. And please take good care.
Thank you, and you too. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.